Major employers in California are announcing layoffs, and the governor is responding on camera. Statements, press conferences, promises of support, and a tone that suggests surprise. But the surprise is not genuine. It is staged. Because the market does not react to emotions. It reacts to incentives. It reacts to costs. It reacts to rules that change midstream. This is not a recession story. It is not a political story. It is not a normal market cycle. Layoffs do not suddenly appear because of a headline or a single quarterly report. They appear because the math stopped working, because the system changed, because the cost of operating in California exceeded the benefit of staying. The real cause is structural. It is policy, incentives, and the hidden economics of compliance. It is a business environment where the cost of labor, energy, insurance, and regulation is rising faster than productivity can offset. And where the timeline for building, expanding, and scaling is unpredictable. I'm Brooklyn. This channel follows money, timelines, and consequences. We do not cover the story you are told. We cover the story the numbers reveal. Mainstream coverage misses the chain reaction between policy and layoffs. It focuses on the headline, not the system. Here is the thesis. California's layoffs are not a political failure. They are a mathematical one. This is not about politics. This is about math, incentives, and reality. And we will break it down step by step, from the first hidden signal to the moment the layoffs hit the public. Before layoffs appear on a payroll, the first signals are rarely visible to the public. They show up in boardrooms, not headlines. They show up in planning documents, not press releases. They show up in a shift from growth to caution. The timeline begins with early policy shifts and compliance changes. Not one dramatic law, but a steady stream of new requirements. Labor mandates expand. Energy and emissions rules tighten. Permitting becomes more complex. The state's message is clear. California is moving toward a cleaner, more regulated future. The intended goal is stability, but the result is higher operating costs. Business sentiment changes quietly. Companies do not announce they are worried. They simply begin to factor new costs into their forecasts. When compliance costs rise, hiring slows. When the timeline for expansion becomes uncertain, capital is reallocated. When labor costs rise faster than productivity, employers adjust. Employers begin adjusting hiring and expansion plans. A new office location is delayed. A planned factory expansion is scaled back. A hiring pipeline is paused. Not because the company is failing, but because the cost of scaling is no longer justified. The first ripple appears in payroll. Hiring freezes become common. Positions remain open longer. Contractors are not renewed. Employees are asked to take on extra work without extra pay. The workforce begins to tighten, not with a dramatic cut, but with a slow, controlled reduction in momentum. This phase looks normal from the outside. A company is being cautious. A company is optimizing resources. But the pattern is consistent across industries. And when multiple employers begin freezing hiring at once, the first domino is already in motion. The mid-phase escalation begins when the cost increases become unavoidable. Not theoretical. Not future projections. Actual increases in the numbers that determine whether a business stays or leaves. Labor costs rise in multiple directions at once. Wages increase, benefits expand, and staffing requirements become more complex. The cost of compliance is no longer a small addition. It becomes a core part of payroll calculations. Companies begin to realize that labor is no longer just a cost. It is a variable that is rising faster than revenue can match. Regulation expands. New reporting requirements arrive. New inspections become mandatory. New penalties become larger. Compliance becomes a full-time job inside many companies. It is not simply following rules. It is constantly updating processes to meet evolving standards. Energy costs also climb. Electricity rates rise, and the pressure to electrify increases. Companies are asked to upgrade equipment, shift to cleaner power, and meet emissions targets. But infrastructure upgrades lag behind policy. So companies face higher costs without the promised support. Insurance costs rise and risk ratings tighten. Insurance is not just a line item. It is a barrier to operating. When insurance becomes expensive or unavailable, companies are forced to reduce exposure. They cut back operations. They limit expansion. They prepare for the worst. At this point, companies begin re-evaluating their long-term presence in California. Not because they dislike the state, because the math no longer supports it. Boards start asking whether the state's operating environment can remain stable for the next 5 to 10 years. If the answer is no, the company begins to plan for a future with less California. Layoff decisions become more likely because layoffs are the fastest lever a company can pull. When costs rise and revenue growth slows, layoffs reduce payroll immediately. Layoffs are not always a sign of failure. They are often a sign of risk management. And risk management becomes the priority when the operating environment becomes unstable. This is the point where the system begins to push back. Not through a single policy, through the cumulative effect of many policies. The result is a shift from growth to contraction. And contraction leads to layoffs. The final phase before layoffs is where the decision becomes unavoidable. It is not a sudden collapse. It is a calculated response to a system that no longer supports expansion. Infrastructure constraints begin to bite. Office space costs rise. Transportation and logistics strain under congestion. Energy grid capacity becomes a limiting factor for growth. When a company cannot expand operations without major infrastructure upgrades, the cost of growth rises sharply. And when growth becomes expensive, the company shifts to cost reduction. Tax policy shifts also play a role. New tax structures, higher rates, or altered incentives change the profitability of operating in the state. Companies do not ignore taxes. They plan around them. When the tax forecast becomes uncertain, the company's long-term planning becomes unstable. And unstable planning is a risk that boards do not accept. Litigation risk increases. California's legal environment is complex. Class action lawsuits, labor disputes, and regulatory challenges create ongoing exposure. The cost of legal defense is not just money. It is time and uncertainty. It makes operating in the state riskier, not just more expensive. At this stage, corporate boards begin to make hard decisions. They evaluate the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving. They evaluate the risk of expanding versus the risk of downsizing. And they decide to cut headcount or relocate operations to other states where the operating environment is more predictable. When layoffs are announced, they are framed as strategic, a realignment, a streamlining, a refocusing on core operations. The language is polished. The tone is calm. But the message is clear. The company is responding to a system that no longer supports growth. This is the moment the public sees. The layoffs, the press release, the governor's response. But the decision was made long before the announcement, driven by the cumulative effect of infrastructure constraints, tax shifts, and legal risk. And the system continues to shift, even as the public reacts. Major employers do not operate like small businesses. They are not simply selling a product. They are managing complex systems of people, capital, and time. They plan years in advance, with forecasts, budgets, and projected growth. They invest in facilities, technology, and talent. And they do this under the assumption that the operating environment will remain stable. Margins are thin even for large companies. Not because they are failing, but because competition is intense and innovation moves quickly. A company's profit is often measured in percentage points, not in round numbers. When costs rise, profits shrink. When profits shrink, investors demand action. And layoffs are one of the fastest ways to reduce costs. High fixed costs make layoffs the easiest lever. Rent, equipment, software, and facilities do not disappear when revenue slows. But labor can be reduced quickly. Layoffs immediately reduce payroll expenses. They improve short-term cash flow. They make the company look efficient on paper. This is why layoffs are always the first response when a company faces uncertainty. California is uniquely vulnerable to policy shifts. The state's regulations are extensive and constantly evolving. The cost of compliance is not just a line item. It is an ongoing operational requirement. California also has high labor costs, high energy costs, and high litigation exposure. When policy shifts, the entire operating environment changes. The hidden tax in this system is uncertainty. Uncertainty is not a vague concept. It is a financial variable. It is the reason companies increase reserves, delay expansion, and reduce hiring. When rules can change midstream, companies cannot plan. When the timeline for permitting is unpredictable, they cannot budget accurately. When energy costs are volatile, they cannot forecast profitability. And when litigation risk rises, they cannot predict future expenses. Translation: uncertainty is the cost that cannot be calculated. It forces companies to assume a worst-case scenario. And when the worst-case scenario becomes the baseline, the decision to lay off workers becomes rational. This is the system mechanism, not politics, not ideology. A chain of incentives and constraints that eventually forces companies to reduce headcount. To understand the scale, imagine a major tech campus in California. A large employer with a 2,500-person workforce. The facility includes offices, data centers, and supporting infrastructure. On paper, the campus is profitable and sustainable. The company planned for steady growth and stable costs. Then the environment shifted. Start with compliance costs. New reporting requirements and labor regulations force the company to add compliance staff and systems. This adds $12 million annually in overhead. The company does not cancel projects. It simply absorbs the cost because it must. Next, energy costs rise. Data centers are energy intensive. California's energy rates increase, and the pressure to electrify more systems grows. The campus energy bill increases by $8 million annually. That is not a small number. It is the equivalent of hundreds of jobs worth of payroll. Now add insurance costs. The company faces higher premiums and higher risk ratings. Insurance for facilities and operations increases by $6 million per year. This is not a one-time cost. It is recurring. Then add tax changes. New taxes and altered incentives reduce the net profit from the campus. The company's effective tax rate increases by several percentage points, reducing profit by $10 million annually. The combined cost increases are now $36 million per year. That is the cost of hundreds of jobs. It is also the cost of delaying new projects, slowing expansion, and reducing investment in innovation. But the problem is not just the total cost. It is the compounding effect. Each cost increase amplifies the next. Higher energy costs reduce the budget for expansion. Higher compliance costs reduce the budget for hiring. Higher insurance costs reduce the budget for risk. Higher taxes reduce the company's ability to absorb future changes. The operation that was once profitable becomes unsustainable. Not because the company is failing, but because the environment has changed faster than the business can adapt. The math no longer supports growth. So the company reduces headcount to restore profitability. It becomes a rational decision, not a dramatic one. Translation: when costs compound, a once profitable operation becomes a liability. And layoffs become the tool that corrects the imbalance. Domino 1. Employees lose income and stability. The first domino is immediate and personal. Layoffs hit employees directly. Paychecks shrink or disappear. Benefits vanish or become uncertain. People lose the stability that their household budgets rely on. The impact is not only financial. It affects long-term planning, career paths, and family decisions. When a major employer cuts headcount, the effect is not limited to those laid off. It spreads through the household and into the community. Domino 2. Local businesses and housing markets weaken. The second domino hits local economies. Employees spend money locally. They shop, dine, pay rent, and use services. When income drops, local spending drops. Restaurants see fewer customers. Retail stores sell less. Service businesses lose contracts. Housing markets begin to weaken because demand falls. Renters may move out, and landlords face vacancies. Property values can stagnate. The local economy begins to shrink quietly, not with a headline, but with fewer transactions. Domino 3. State revenue and public services face strain. The third domino expands to the state level. California relies on income and corporate taxes to fund public services. When layoffs increase, tax revenue falls. The state collects less from payroll, less from consumer spending, and less from business profits. That means less funding for schools, infrastructure, public safety, and healthcare. The state then faces a choice: cut services, raise taxes, or borrow. All three options have consequences, and the public feels them. These dominoes do not fall one after another in neat order. They fall together, reinforcing each other. Employees lose income, local businesses lose customers, and the state loses revenue. The result is a system that tightens, slowly, quietly, and without a single dramatic event. The first person is a software engineer who joined the company when the campus was still expanding. He moved across the state for the job, signed a lease, and started building a life around a steady paycheck. He was not a headline. He was a routine employee, doing routine work in a routine office. When the layoff notice arrived, it was not a dramatic moment. It was a meeting, a handshake, and a final email. The severance package covered a few months. But the real cost was the gap between jobs and the time it takes to rebuild momentum. He now has to rethink rent, savings, and long-term plans. He is not panicking. He is recalculating. That is the quiet impact. The second person is a small cafe owner 2 blocks from the same campus. For years, the lunch rush was predictable. Employees would grab coffee, lunch, or snacks between meetings. It was not a large number of customers, but it was steady. After the layoffs, the cafe did not close. It did not make a statement. It simply became quieter. Daily sales dropped in small amounts. The owner reduced staff hours, then stopped hiring. He did not announce a crisis. He adjusted the way a business survives. His rent stayed the same. His costs did not shrink. Only revenue did. Both stories are ordinary. Both are quiet. But they are connected to the same chain of decisions. The system that made the layoffs possible is the same system that made the ripple inevitable. The irony is not that the layoffs happened. The irony is that they happened under policies designed to protect workers, promote stability, and push innovation. The stated goals were workforce security and economic resilience. The result was the opposite, because the incentives changed the math. When costs rise, boards respond the way they always do. They reduce exposure. They move operations. They cut headcount. They freeze expansion. The policies intended to create certainty created the opposite, because the certainty was not in the rules, but in the penalties. The system was built around a simple assumption. If regulations tighten, companies will adapt and continue. But adaptation has limits when margins are thin and risks are unpredictable. The policies did not break a single company. They broke the incentive structure that made long-term planning possible. When planning becomes risky, companies stop planning. That is the real failure. This is not an isolated event in one sector. The same model is being repeated across industries and across states. When costs rise, when compliance becomes uncertain, when litigation risk increases, companies respond in the same predictable way. They protect shareholders first. They protect operations second. And they protect workers last. If you are watching this unfold in one industry, you are watching a template. A new standard for how businesses will behave under pressure. And the warning is clear, not because it is dramatic, but because it is predictable. The governor responded after major employers announced layoffs, but the real trigger was the shifting cost structure behind the scenes. Early policy changes raised compliance burdens and created uncertainty, pushing companies to reevaluate long-term commitments. As costs rose, hiring freezes became layoffs, and the decision to cut staff became the simplest way to reduce exposure. The impact spread from employees to local businesses, and then to the state's revenue base. The system that aimed to protect workers ended up changing incentives in a way that reduced job security. The chain of cause and effect was not visible in headlines, but it was visible in decisions, timelines, and budgets. And the pattern is now repeating in other industries and states, not because of a single failure, but because of a predictable system response. So the question is this, and it is a question of accountability. If policies are designed to protect jobs, why do they create incentives that shrink them? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you want more investigative breakdowns like this, subscribe. The consequences are still unfolding, and the next domino has already started to fall.